Witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie.
Приветствую много сърдечно. Казвам се Дорота Лошевич и имам честа да приветствам международната публика на една изключителна конференция Европейския съюз 2.0, програма за възстановяването, която е организирана конференция от Европейската парламентарната група на европейските консерватори и реформисти. Изключително е момента, в който се провежда тази среща, тъй като невъзможно е да се такива високо уважаеми панелисти, гости и публиката да седнат заедно. Но благодарение на днешната технология можем да позволим да се проведе такава среща. Така, второто важен момент е това, че тази конференция, която се провежда по-настоящем благодарение на кампанията на европейските консерватори и реформистите, бъдещето на Европа, нова надежда, тази среща се провежда, както знаете, в Кралския замък в Варшава и тук започваме един цикъл от 15 конференции, които ще се проведат в Европа. Така че тази конференция е отговор на настоящата ситуация в Европейския съюз и като експерти и лидерите, политическите лидери търсят отговор на въпроса дали и как и в какво направление трябва да се промени Европейският съюз. Всичко, разбира се, в името на бъдещето и благото на европейската общност. Днешната среща, разбира се, ще има първата част на днешната среща, ще има, така да се каже, експертен характер, ще бъде предоставена предимно на експертите, а във втората част ще вземат участие политици, между другото, Jorge Buxadé, шеф на делегацията на партията Vox, а също така Карло Фиданца, шеф на партията Fratelli d'Italia и професор Ryszard Legutko, както и Zdzisław Krasnodębski, който е председател, последният господин професор е председател на работната група по институционалната реформа. И така, искам да ви представя сега, присъства заедно с нас в студиото във Варшава се намира професор Ryszard Legutko, а също така и Raffaele Fitto, който е на линия, на пряка връзка с нас, като един професор. Даваме думата.
Witamy na wydarzeniu
Приветстваме ви сърдечно на едно събитие, което събитие се отразява в цяла Европа, т.е. парламентарната група на европейските консерватори и реформисти, политическа група, която обединява европейските депутати, което защитава суверенните права на нашите граждани. По-настоящем ние броиме 62 души от 15 държави членки на Евросъюза. Имам огромната чест да съпредседателствам нашата парламентарна група, заедно с моят колега, съпредседател Рафаеле Фитто от Рим. Рафаеле, радвам се, че се присъедини към нас, че си заедно с нас. Сърдечно ви благодаря за това, че вие приехте поканата за тази инициатива, и именно днес да започнем нашата инициатива, т.е. цикълът от срещи, от видеоконференции. Искаме да поговорим с представителите на политиката, на културата, искаме да поговорим относно новият модел, който ще трябва да бъде задействан в Европа. Искаме Европейският съюз да се обърне отново да се върне към своите източници. Искаме да кажем, че ние не сме тези, които ще разрушават Европа. Ние искаме по-скоро да се върнем към изворите, към основните идеи, характерни за развитието на нашата общност. Дойде време вече да се напишеме нова история на Европа и мислим, че консерваторите и реформистите от нашата парламентарна група ще могат да изиграят една огромна роля. Имаме компетенции, имаме умения и можем много неща да допринесем. И мисля, че също така от името на Джордж Мелоне, който е председател на партията на консерваторите и реформистите, мисля, че това е също един допълнителен принос от нашата страна в тази насока. Благодарение на това, този принос ще бъде още по-съществен, още по-значим, И бъдещето на Европа, разбира се, не може да бъде такова, каквото ни показват, каквото говорят някои елити. Не може да бъдат това някакви решения, които нямат реален характер. Не може да казват те кой е добрият, кой е лошият. Тоест, такива псевдоистини искат да наказват някои държави, които правителства са избрани съвсем законно от своите граждани. И бъдещето на Европа трябва да бъде това, че ние преди всичко ще оцениме нашите общи корени, спецификата на отделните държави. Искаме тези държави да бъдат суверенни и тези държави да работят заедно в сътрудничество. И днес, особено когато се говори за ревизия на договорите, и ние казваме, че ние като група, като парламентарна група на консерваторите и реформистите също от доста дълго време подкрепяме тази идея. Така че по-голямо зачитане на правата, на прерогативите и по-настоящем в сегашният си вид Евросъюза не е в състояние да отговори на тези огромни предизвикателства, и икономически, и социални, и във връзка с сигурността. Липсата на солидарност, особено през първият етап, който беше характерен за развитието на пандемията, много често някои правителства си позволиха да ни учат, да ни поучват какво следва да правим. Като, разбира се забравя каква е огромната роля, която трябва да изиграем във външната политика. Всички ние знаем колко важна е ролята на Европа в Средиземноморският басейн, а в същото време Европа вече не е в състояние да защити своите външни граници и не е в състояние да отговори на проблема на външната емиграция, така че доста дълго време вече държавите са оставени сами на себе си. Така че Европа така да се каже, ги забрави, изостави. Така че искаме да представим идеята за една нова Европа, която Европа чрез своите държави членки ще действа на международната арена, така да се каже, много по-активно. Ще бъде главният играч, главният актьор на тази сцена. Така че, благодаря на солидарността, тази Европа ще бъде много важен играч, така че ще бъде нов шанс и източник за доверие. Източник на доверие спрямо своите граждани. Така че това са главните точки от нашето ново послание. И затова изключително ми е приятно, че мога заедно да започна с вас тази нова конференция, която ще ни заведе именно при тази новата Европа и заедно с господин професор Легутко. И много му благодаря за това, че много се радвам, че ние двамата можем да председателстваме нашата парламентарна група и че можем да свържем нашите знания, неговите умения и по този начин това всичко спомогна да координираме нашата работа и можем да изработим нашето становище и да го представим именно на тази конференция. По-късно да го представим също така и пред цялата Евросъюз. Така че нашата група ще бъде много активна и много благодаря на всички онези, които ще вземат участие в днешната конференция, а така също и на тези, които решават за това, които имат решаващ глас при оформянето на нашето становище.
Raffaele, dziękuję, że mogłeś się z nami połączyć.
Искам да споделя също опасенията на моят колега, на Рафаеле Фитто, относно неотдавното минало на Европейския съюз, а така споделям и неговите надежди относно бъдещето на Европейския съюз. Благодаря на лидерите на европейските реформисти и консерватисти. Искам да припомня само това, че ЕКР-то е на становището, че тази една чудесна идея, която е залегнала в самото начало на Европейския съюз, а именно идеята за суверенните народи, които ще се обединят в едно такова сдружение на идеите, и че именно тази идея беше, така може да се каже, че беше изневерена. Обаче през последните години тази идея беше подменена именно от идеологията и именно множество от европейските елити в Брюксел, в някои други национальные столици започнаха да поставят под съмнение това национално сътрудничество, така че появяват се такива тенденции, защото Европейският съюз да се превърне в една централизирана държава, федерализирана такъв орган, институт. В резултат, така че по такъв начин Европейският съюз се отдалечава от своите граждани. Европейският съюз не успя да се справи с проблемите за опазване на здравето на своите граждани и много често се поставят под съмнение, се поставят под въпрос ролята на Европейския съюз и се появят също така опасения от страна на гражданите на Европа. Затова много е важно именно да се набележи посоката, в която следва да вървят европейските народи. Така и за да стане така, то длъжностните лица, експертите ще трябва да слушат тези, които имат какво да кажат, да чуят гласът на гражданите, да го разберат този глас и да го зачитат този глас. Но дали това въобще е възможно? С този въпрос се обръщам към професор Zdzisław Krasnodębski, който бюрото на европейските консерватори и реформисти го е назначило за председател на групата.
We have other guests who are going to be introduced by Professor Krasnodębski. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We've got splendid guests who've joined us. In the first part, we'll have a wonderful French philosopher, Chantal Delsol, and a professor of history from Belgium, Professor Engels, a columnist. In the second part, we are going to meet Madam Professor Magdalena Bainczyk and Professor Tomasz Grosse, a lawyer and expert in political studies. The floor goes to Professor Chantal Delsol first. There's a following question that I need to address to you. The qualities of today's Europe were created and shaped in the Renaissance period. History before that is a kind of pre-history. However, in your wonderful books, you've been criticizing the key notions of Renaissance. The same applies to the European Union. Advancement and emancipation. Why is that so? Madame, the floor is yours.
Je ne critique pas l'émancipation et le progrès. Je pense que il est impossible de critiquer l'émancipation.
Well, you cannot criticize emancipation, neither emancipation nor advancement. I criticize the perverse idea. Advancement has become an ideology on its own rights. Initially, emancipation was of Christian origin. Emancipation was initially a positive thing, a dignified thing. During the Renaissance era, they started working on advancement that was turned into ideology. It was quite a rigid principle, something taken for granted. It was not the original initial idea as such. This is not the emancipation in Judeo-Christian world, because it dates back to the early biblical times. Therefore, the system was kind of derailed, and then this deviation became a program. A little does it have in common with common sense. It is detached from its own roots. Initially, the conditions were different. For example, freedom of your choices was addressed at St. Paul's letters. It is both something old and something new. We need to speak about freedom of your conscience alongside with responsibility. Devoid responsibility, well, there's nothing to speak about. If advancement is believed to be experts' activities who act on their own, well, it's in contrast to what we used to see at the beginning, and this is criticized. The book describes crisis phenomena in Europe. There is a comparison with the Roman Empire collapse. Professor, what is this analogy between today's and the old times? There are certain similarities or parallels which make you think. In my book devoted to the collapse, indicated that most of the crisis symptoms that tears the Western world apart are not new. They are quite similar to the factors that increased the pace of collapse of the Roman Empire. Demography, crisis, unemployment, the families crippling, the collapse of old religions, counter-culture movements, oligarchs that are pretty rich, asymmetrical wars, identity crisis, institutions paralysis, criminality. Politics and business put together. Lots of similarities with late Roman Empire that was on the verge of collapse. We need to think about the consequences. This is a crucial point to think. Our predecessors wanted to give bread and games to the peoples and their nations, as it happens today, like today's media that fool people in order to conceal true problems. Rome was quite similar to today's reality in the sense that populists, they were unable to stop populists. The political system was weaker and weaker. There were traditional parties and populist parties. Great business tycoons and ideologies had great impact on parties. Everybody wanted to have monopoly of power. In order to stop this populistic threat, the elite was required to exceed the rights they dictated to others, as it is the case of the European Union and other politically correct member states. The coronavirus crisis will only aggravate this kind of activity, this kind of elite's impact upon citizens. It will be even more fragmented, which will result in an implosion. The crisis time might see wars at the Mediterranean. periphery states, like Visegrad Group states, might be able to avoid the destruction that endangers France or Belgium. This or that way, whole Europe will suffer from this multipolar conflict, left-wing versus tradition, religion, non-religion, rich, poor, Christianity, Islamic world. Nonetheless, will preserve European institutions. However, the situation will change. There'll be groups controlling media and finances. There'll be a civilization clash in megalopolis. It's hard to say who's the upper hand in this fight. You can feel it under the surface, be it the United States or France. The longer the crisis continues, the more should be afraid of the complete transformation of our states, so that they'll be controlled in a military way. Who will be the winner? Who will be the upper hand? Will we have to combine a military regime with conservative reform? How should we preserve the spirit of the Republic? Who will be the winner of this combat to control our continent? If we want to avoid the political correctness, if we want to avoid the situation when our democratic values vanish and give way to authoritarianism, we need to do our best to avoid the worst. We need to carry out comprehensive reform of our states. Thank you very much, Professor. And Professor Delsol, the question to you. One of your latest books was translated into Polish, and it is a very popular book in our country. The book describes today's attitude. We are world-averse or world-hating people. So if you describe this attitude in a nutshell, answering the following question. Referring to the diagnosis you offered with regards to today's world and civilization, if we wanted to reformulate European values that are included in the EU Treaty second paragraph, how would you rephrase it?
Well, if we are talking about hatred to the world or aversion to the world, I have used this explicit term because I think right now, in case of the EU, we are witnessing communist objectives being brought to life with terror. Humanity is too rational. And you've mentioned in your question values quoted in Article 2 of the European Treaty. I don't like the word value because it's relative. Principles or rules sound much better, but it's irrelevant. We are talking about the meaning of words. So it's also fair to mention hatred to the world when we are talking about respect, overall respect. We all believe that we respect our views, our opinions, and it doesn't matter if we are conservatives or neo-modernists. But we are talking about respecting one's dignity. In line with provisions of Article 2, we should interpret it in the following way. A child aged 7 will be free to change his or her gender if he or she so pleases. So I think most of us will find it unacceptable. So everything depends on what we understand as respect for dignity. There is a whole trend, contemporary trend, which claims that it's important to respect democracy, freedom, and that it equals respect based or driven by individual will. I'm talking about such rules like freedom, democracy, dignity. I don't think those values are underpinned by will of an individual, because we have lost our common ground. I think it's the change of the century, in fact. And we failed to realize it. Right now, we are witnessing a breakthrough. We had a breakthrough at the turn of the 20th century. And this is when it all began. I'm talking about the beginning of the end of Christianity, the Catholic religion. In the past, Christianity was the state religion. It provided inspirations for legal acts. So we see the end and a breakthrough that is leading us towards something new. We can say that it's a watershed moment, and it seems to me that many people fail to realize it. So we do not agree with principles and rules specified by Article 2 of the European Treaty. Regrettably, I can't hear what others are saying. Is it normal? Well, conditions are far from being normal. I just hope that in the future, in not so distant future, we'll be no longer meeting in the virtual world. Of course, the pandemic has made many things very different. It also makes communication challenging, but let's hope that we understand each other as far as key issues are concerned. You've said that interpretation of those general terms like human dignity, that our differences do not lie in, and in response to my first question, you've mentioned progress, emancipation, that they cannot be rejected. It's just a matter of how we interpret this phenomenon, emancipation and dignity, democracy. As we know, values embedded in treaties are subject to very different interpretations, and we are now dealing with a highly aggressive ideology. I wholly agree with Madam Professor. We are now witnessing the beginning of a new era. And it's not an era that breeds hope, that it's underpinned by the right values. And a question to Professor Engels, because you are the author of an essay, Preamble to Future Constitution or the European Charter. And this is where you wanted to provide a definition of alternative European values. Can you tell us roughly, in a nutshell, because regrettably in this format we can't deep dive into this topic, but which contents, which values did you want to include in the preamble? Well, the preamble is based on three values, three threads embedded in patriotism, political patriotism in Europe, which is driven by positive perception of our history. I wanted to demonstrate, to together with other international intellectuals, including Chantal Delsol and Professor Krasnodębski, in this book, I've pinpointed it that on one hand we need Europe, which is quite strong because we need to protect our individual nations against the demographic explosion in Africa, the rise in significance of Russia and China, radicalization of the Middle East, and on the other hand, Europe will be acceptable for its citizens only when it stays faithful to Western historical traditions. So we can't undermine them in the name of chimeric historical universalism. So we should cut away from anti-democratic centralization of the EU, which was recently reflected by the blackmail addressed to Europe, in Europe to Poland and Hungary. In order to do so, we need to have adequate competencies and rights, such as a constitution able to protect citizens of member states, protect the concept of Europe, rebuild confidence in the European idea. And secondly, we need to simplify operations of current EU institutions. We need to have them simplified to make them relevant for EU citizens. And we propose to radically reform the European Parliament Commission to reduce its structures to 12 competencies, because we want our civilization to survive. Those competencies would include protection of borders, fight against crime, protection of borders, protection against external enemies, foreign policy, scientific research, unification of the judicial system, and simplification and unification of pan-European structures and finance. It's all essential. It must be implemented, but we need another factor. Europe must declare anew that it's demonstrates solidarity to its values. It must embrace anew humanistic values in the light of its historic resources. So, in other words, we need to put an end to activities which are now implemented by leftist parties. We need to do that in order to prevent the destruction of our civilization. So it's a real mission, a genuine mission for our society, for our community, because we need to preserve our democratic Judeo-Greek Christian traditions. We need to protect life across all stages of life and protect our subsidiarity, regional, local diversification, democracy, and I mean the judicial system, the equality of men and women. And what seems to be the priority is the European interest, and not of the rest of the world, because it's us who are accountable for that. We must take accountability for the environment. These are values which confirm certain political and moral values that obviously have some exceptions or permit for some exceptions, but they will define the new civilizational normality in Western Europe, which has been lost as we see dispersion, as we see focus shifted to the struggle for minority rights. So we need to keep the political and social system in check. So to wrap up, it's the last resort which may help us federate our resources and bring them around a joint program, and also demonstrate to citizens that unlike politically correct media are saying we can reform the EU, but we can also do so without revisiting chauvinism and national states. We can be both European patriots and conservatives. If we fail, because perhaps the EU will be radicalized, and in such case, our social system may collapse before we manage to rebuild the European system after another 2 decades. Picking up the pieces, just like in case of the fallen Roman Empire.
Now, I'd like to address Professor Delsol, because we've already heard about institutional changes in the preamble, in the recitals. You've included some kind of ideas on competences of European institutions, national states, competences restoring. Madam Professor was addressing specific culture-related tendencies, a comprehension of human dignity changing, secular changes that are believed by some to be unavoidable. This political change might be very difficult, if not impossible, without culture change. Is there a possibility to reverse the tendency you have outlined, kind of preaching doom and gloom, saying this is the hatred towards the world, the destructive attitude, as you call it, specific things, specific values, principles that belong to European civilization are contrary to civilization as such. Can we reverse this history-related trend? Have you noticed any symptoms of this counter-movement, the movement that would bring all of us together, you in France, Professor Engels in Belgium, us here in Poland, and our colleagues in Italy and other countries? Visiting different places in Europe, being an MP, I've met lots of people who agree with us in their diagnosis without actual hope for change. Do you hope there'll be a change? Will we reverse this culture tendency?
L'espoir que nous pouvons avoir, c'est que des réunions comme celle que vous organisez aujourd'hui continuent à...
Meetings like ours will further contribute to interest in this kind of debate, and this will bring even more hope. The situation can be ameliorated. We may differ when it comes to when we are compared or juxtaposed with the mainstream. We need to fight for a right for free speech, for freedom of speech. Poland has been fighting for its autonomy too. Not everybody has to think the same way. This applies to Hungary and to other countries. This needs to be highlighted. It needs to be highlighted in many other countries, including France. In France, we know that people differ in their thinking. It is all about autonomy, freedom of speech. This needs to be highlighted. We don't have to run towards the same goal, direction, be a part of the same stream, obligatory for everybody to have the same line of thinking that has been imposed upon us. I'm quite optimistic because we need to defend ourselves. We cannot perish. We need to act on. Thank you very much, Madam Professor. I do hope that better trans-border cooperation will result in synergies. Thus, many problems that we have been facing at national level will be solved hand in hand. Conservatives are quite positive. They love their national cultures and Europe's diversity, but they have this difficulty. Rarely do they create international organizations. We need to make the best use of this possibility to bring our forces together, to bundle together. And please welcome two other guests at this panel. As it has already been announced, Madam Professor Magdalena Bainczyk, a lawyer, and the other one, Professor Tomasz Grosse, specialist in political studies. We are going to start on a note that we've heard in the first part of our conversation, but more focused on legal and institutional issues. Madam Professor Bainczyk, something that is very much up to date. Do you think European Union respects the laws, the treaties in force, the procedures in force? Is this a question of interpretation or observance? Are they observed? Are they precise enough to result in concrete political activities? We've learned that Article 2 means that different notions might be connected with these generally worded values. What's the foundation of the European Union like? That is the treaties. Are the treaties respected? Madam Professor, the floor is yours. Precise wording of the treaties, that was the question. These are international agreements. By the very nature of an international agreement, this is pretty general and is subject to interpretation. The problem is, who is the one to interpret it? Who's got the last word in the interpretation process? And the interpretation as such, is it in a good faith? Is it in accordance with the intention of the signees of the agreement or contract? There are specific difficulties at these levels. I hope these are interim, because these are mainly the European institutions that undersign the treaties, the contracts as such, and they wish to expand the scope of their competences. It's not to their interest to observe the competences they've been entrusted with, because this principle is a protective one for the member state. The last word belongs to the European Union Court of Justice. This is one of the European institutions, and treaties have been the motor for integration, the driving force for integration. The Lisbon Treaty, that was the last revision of the treaty, streamlined the objectives, values, and competences of the European Union, alongside with a whole array of instructions designed to protect member states against competences expansion of the European institutions. The Lisbon Treaty order was insufficient. The division between objectives, values, and competences crippled. Objectives, values, and competences blurred, and European Union institutions breached their competences on occasions. So you need to restore the treaty state of thing and restore the observance of legal regulations in the European Union. Thank you, Madam Professor. based on the treaties that were changed on numerous occasions, the treaties that are enforced at the moment. The Lisbon Treaty was the most serious, most profound revision. The European Union laws have been evolving, including the basic ones. At the same time, the EU evolution has got a clearly set direction, expansion of competences of European Union institutions. And this question goes to Professor Grosse. How could we put a stop to this kind of evolution that, step by step, leads to even greater federalization and centralization of decisions, staunching the decisions of the member states? What are the sources of the process? How has it happened that, regardless the intentions, the process proceeds? How to stop it? Professor, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me today. I hope that you can hear me loud and clear. Ladies and gentlemen, let me answer those questions. Perhaps I'll start with saying, well, obviously, at least 4 people engaged in European studies for some time or even for a long time, European institutions have been expanding their competencies at the expense of member states. We are not calling it bypassing treaties or violating rule of law. It's often dubbed as contribution to development of European integration. So if the European Commission intervenes contrary to the treaty with competencies of national governments, everything is justified as a beneficial process of expanding European integration. The European Parliament follows suit. I can list many examples when it definitely steps the line. Legal regulations and acts of law do not give the Parliament such prerogatives. But it does its best to expand its competencies in real life, and the same goes for the European Court of Justice. For example, supremacy or supervision or precedence over national law, even if those are exclusive competencies of member states. Countries are authorized by the treaty to have autonomous courts in line with choices made by local national democracy, but the tribunal, the European Court of Justice, has the right to check if treaties are followed. So the question is, what can we do to have it fixed? How can we prevent such practices? Well, I'll be frank. It's a daunting exercise. Why? Because it's a matter of dominant narrative in European integrations where it takes its toll on people protecting the sovereignty of member states or sovereignty of national democracies. If you are defending European treaties, you are dubbed a Eurosceptic. You are accused of preventing further European integration. institutions that usurp competencies that are not given to them by treaties are treated like as heroes of this process. They are lionized as heroes of European integration. So, narration-wise, it's very challenging to win this war. And this is best illustrated by the recent skirmish for European funds and rule of law. We could see the concentrated offensive of European media and some Polish media, which joined the fray against the stance adopted by the Polish government, which was making references to treaties, and it wanted European institutions not to interfere with competencies of member states. Well, it's very difficult to win this rhetorical battle, but from what I understand, it's not mission impossible. And this is why we are having this conference. Are there proposals for very specific changes or a discussion about these changes, about the system of the EU in order to put stop to those trends and overstepping the line in terms of competencies of national institutions? I don't know if I should comment on it now or perhaps later. Okay, so let's go back to Madam Professor, and we'll go back to you very soon, because you've said that it's that narration is very important, that political trends are important, that the expansion of EU competencies is teamed up with different discussions on the political discourse. This discourse continues in the world of politics and in the media. Professor Delsol has mentioned some cultural links and tropes related to it. So a question to Magdalena Bainczyk, who is a lawyer and theoretician of law. Do we have the right legal tools in place to put this process to a halt? What do you think about amendment of treaties? Should we rewrite certain things anew to put these trends to a halt? Or perhaps legal tools when we are faced by certain cultural and political tendencies, are they effective at all? Because you've said, you have mentioned goodwill, that there is no goodwill, and we are not interpreting European treaties in good faith, that we are adding a whole new sense, a whole new meaning, like in the famous treaty, Article 2 of the European Union. We are accused of violating European values, and we believe we are guardians of European values, and our opponents or the other side is violating them. So coming back to this question, do you think that we are able, using legal measures, to put this process to a halt, and how should we amend treaties to do so? To put those negative processes in their tracks. Of course, it's all possible in the context of treaties, but you need to keep in mind that treaties can be amended with the approval of all member states, which is why the first step forward is creating this narrative mentioned by Professor Grosse, which is very challenging, but not impossible. I am making a reference to what Professor Chantal said, we have to stay put and keep on indicating another way forward for collaboration between nations. And in terms of legal tools, we should revisit the pragmatism of founding fathers of the EU. This pragmatism is also visible in current treaties. I just wanted to recall Article 1 of the European Treaty, which states that member states give competencies to the European Union, which are essential for execution of common goals. So in the treaty itself, we see that the EU is of secondary importance, or takes second place after member countries and serves to achieve their goals. If we want to reverse this trend, if we don't want EU to evolve into a quasi-federal body, we need to rethink objectives of the EU and make them more specific, and later make a review of European competencies and specify in greater detail European competencies. If we fail to do so, if we don't restore the institutional balance, seen as the equilibrium between the European Parliament and intergovernmental bodies, the European Council and the Council of Europe, further federalization will be the only way forward by coming back to pragmatism, interpreted as the serving role of the EU in relation to common interests of all member states and all citizens of the EU. If we revisit this pragmatism, we can reverse this trend. And of course, legal-wise, it's doable. But I would like to stress we need to have consensus of all member states. And in order to achieve it, we need to take measures that we are currently taking as part of this conference. So we need to present and highlight alternative versions of events, alternative way forward for the EU, which is optional to guidelines taken by the European Union. Thank you very much. You have mentioned Article 1 of the European Treaty, and we are touching on a vital point from the standpoint of EU architecture, the relationship between the EU and member states. You have mentioned that EU is of secondary importance. It plays secondary role. It is legitimized exclusively by member states. The European Court Constitutional Tribunal said that the EU is governed by interests, by national interests. So the question to Professor Grosse, perhaps this process we are discussing is progressively constraining competencies of individual states, because we've said that they are giving away, that they are merging their sovereignties. But is the sovereignty given away to an extent which was not intended, and it's not even provided in the treaty, and is not encapsulated in this formula about the nations that decide about treaties? So how is it? Is this term sovereignty, is it becoming anachronic? Following the process you have mentioned, or perhaps we are witnessing hierarchization of EU member states. Some member states are no longer lords of treaties, and others are growing in prominence. So that is my question, but you have mentioned certain comments on the process of federalization, which continues, but we are able to curb it. We are able to put it to a halt, and that links to sovereignty of member states. So, Mr. Professor, how do you see it?
Przede wszystkim
First and foremost,
odnieść się może na samym początku do tej kwestii.
let me start by referring to sovereignty question.
Tak jest, jak pan profesor był uprzejmy powiedzieć, przynajmniej w mojej
It's exactly as you, Professor, were saying, at least to my liking.
ocenie. Państw członkowskich
The member state sovereignty, well, it differs. Some countries lose their sovereignty, it's clear. South of Europe, EU member states in the EU zone crisis time.
ich instytucje
As a matter of fact, their parliaments and institutions had no power over taxes and budgets. These are the basic competences of democratic states that we're speaking about that are not delivered. Therefore, we cannot call it sovereignty. They delivered on expenditure cut-offs, staunching expenditure, staunching the increase of expenditure as instructed by the international institutions, mainly the EU Commission, Eurogroup and EMF. These guidelines will be enforced for dozens of years. Greece is one of the examples of the countries that will not regain its sovereignty by 2060. So it will have been struggling for almost 40 years with what is external to it, with these guidelines on how to deliver national policies. Other countries gain extra sovereignty. In the EU zone crisis time, we experienced a very interesting situation that was front page news in the European media. Ireland budget landed in the Bundestag committee that accepted the Irish budget. Only then was the Irish Parliament allowed to tackle the problem. It shows different attitudes towards sovereignty. Germans keep up that sovereignty. The Parliament's control over fiscal policy comprehended this way. If you give your taxpayers money to save other countries, you control the way money is spent. Other countries may not feel equal when exercising this kind of control over taxes or finances. There is a clear asymmetrical process in the European Union with regard to sovereignty, directly associated with the power exercise scope of specific states in EU institutions, be it the European Commission or the Parliament, or intra-government institutions operations. Especially post-Brexit and in EU zone crisis, gave Germany a lot of political impact. Other countries gained much less. The recent rule of law decisions mean that we'll have to follow European Union's institutions, obey, which means that we give up on our autonomy to a large extent. Answering your second question, time allowing, how can we counteract this? Much was said about narrative. It's difficult, but we need to keep trying to create our own narrative, pro-European Union narrative, yet the one that fosters another vision of Europe, the vision of Europe of nations, subsidiarity, not centrality, the European Union bodies that do not overstep the line in their competences. So another version of what we hear about. it's not Poland and Hungary's governments that should observe the rule of law. First and foremost, the European institutions that want to teach us the rule of law should observe the rule of law themselves. How to stop this expansion, how to call for this rule of law observance in European institutions. First and foremost, the Polish Constitutional Tribunal, well, Constitution is the overruling law, and the tribunal decides whether the stipulations are delivered in Poland. The Constitutional Tribunal, like its counterpart in Germany, should assess, from the light of the national constitution, what are the European Union regulations, the actions of European institutions. And this is the perspective to assess the rulings of the European Court of Justice, as it is the case in Germany. The tribunal should assess whether the European Union treaties are not breached. The German tribunal does it, and Polish tribunal should do it the same way. Treaties should not be changed because these are the powers that should be exercised under today's regulations. Another thing that might require a change in treaties, this subsidiarity principle, assistance rule, and national parliaments' actions within the mechanism. These should be even stronger because it's in the treaty, but not in practice. The European Commission and the European Court of Justice disregards subsidiarity principle, so it's not there in practice. It doesn't exist in reality of the institutions. The European Parliament and the European Commission, when overstepping their competences, should bear consequences, should face consequences. The courts should indicate what's right or wrong, be it the European courts or national courts like national tribunals. Another question: how to restore EU member states' equality? How to stop some of the countries being so dominant, mainly Germany and France to some extent? Not only do they dominate in the intragovernmental level, but also dominate in the European Commission and the European Court of Justice. One postulate that has been indicated in the literature of the subject, this is not my own postulate, just like the previous one that was quoted here, less majority voting. We shouldn't assign more competences that should be exercised by qualified majority of votes. That should be less of that. If a member state believes something very important from the point of view of its sovereignty or very important national interest, this country should exercise the right of veto, even if a regular procedure stipulated in the treaty indicates the majority of votes. The qualified majority of votes means that some democratic milieus may cast their votes and decide over others. We are not creating one European society. We are divided into societies. Observing the principles of democracy, we cannot have the situation as follows. One society represented by the government may vote over other governments, the representatives of other societies. This is not democracy. So, if we cannot exercise a consensus, the right to veto is the only way to protect your sovereignty. And another thing, we may wonder if governmental institutions are like Bundesrat, if they represent member states, or US Senate.
Państwa członkowskie nie mają równej liczby głosów.
Why do not have equal number of votes between different EU member states? This violates a kind of federal norm. We are not a federation in the European Union, but we have this kind of majority voting compared to many federations. So intragovernmental institutions, if they resort to voting by qualified majority, should exercise this principle: equal number of votes for states, just one vote for every state. This will be the equality of member states. Some of them have greater number of votes and therefore they are found more important, others are not. We can quote a whole array of different proposals that have been discussed in scientific discussion and literature that has continued for many years. Time constraints make it impossible for me to refer to them. Thank you very much, Professor, for the ideas you were sharing with us. These are pretty revolutionary. We need to stop this political process we are speaking about. We need to alter the narration inside out. But I believe that more and more people find it a necessity. Let's return to Madam Professor Bainczyk. Would you please refer to the ideas Professor Grosse was speaking about? As I was listening to you, a question popped out. This question will be reiterated in Poland, and it will make the waves all over Europe. It should be reiterated in other countries of Europe. European integration that we have been facing in this decade, ever since the Lisbon Treaty. Does it make our country and sovereignty stronger or weaker? This is the question that we have all posed here in Poland, like our colleagues in other countries. But let me return to the basic question. Madam Professor, what is your perception of the changes to be introduced in the European Union? How would you refer to Professor Grosse's proposal? Partially, I share Professor Grosse's opinions and ideas. Let me indicate one more aspect that has not been touched upon in this discussion. The European policy in the member states needs to be changed too, and I'm speaking first and foremost about Poland. Germany has been mentioned on numerous occasions. Germany has got very efficient European and foreign policy and judicial system. Introducing changes in the European Union requires member states to be very agile and swift. European Union change, narrative change, would require to increase national power bodies' agility, efficiency, be it the judicial system and or the bodies that exercise the power. This is the task for all of us. To be more efficient in our European Union policies activities, the rule of law questions and the dispute has indicated great negligence in Poland, including the narrative. We haven't done an overview of other countries' judicial systems. We failed to make this attempt to indicate similarities and differences. I won't be going into details when it comes to European Union reforms, as presented by Professor Grosse. Partially, I share his ideas. I want to indicate the necessity to empower Polish bodies when it comes to European policy exercising. Otherwise, narrative will not be possible, will not be changed in the European Union.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your comments. I wanted to say to our audience watching the conference that together with our guests and other experts, we are collaborating very closely because we need new ideas, we need expert statements. Some of you are drafting them for us. And after this discussion, I see a recommendation that seems to be a paradox, because on the one hand we see we reinforce what is separate for each European nation, its institution, its rights and competencies in relation to the ever-growing European institutions. But on the other hand, we say aloud, and this has been voiced by all our panelists, that in order to do that in order to reform the EU, we can't close ourselves to the outside world, we can't isolate ourselves. Professor Engels has said it very clearly that we believe that we conservatives, people who cherish national traditions, are focused on our particular national interest, but it's in the best interest of our national identity to strengthen the EU. If we want to play a more dominant role as member parties, which are sovereign states governing the European Treaty, we need to change the narration. We need to do our best to fight cultural trends that seem to be inevitable, but takes its toll and destroys the European culture. And we need to think how to reform the EU. So this discussion was just a beginning of our journey, and it will involve a massive effort to reform the European Union, to reset the European community, because this reset is essential. And in order to do that, we do not only need experts, but also politicians. So we need to translate ideas into very specific political proposals. So for the next section of our conference, I would like to invite politicians who collaborate with our parliamentary group, ECR. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for moderating this fascinating discussion. I would like to thank our experts who have presented and shared their ideas. Politicians need to hear the voice of experts. They need to hear the voice of citizens of the European Union, because those changes you have mentioned are certainly far from being easy. But I think the future of Europe is in our hands. So right now it's time to give the voice to political leaders of the largest parties in ECR. So this is coming in a minute, and stay tuned.
Sin fe, no habría Europa.
La liberté est le fondement de l'Europe.
Respekt für das gemeinsame Erbe.
Tradition binds our continent.
Non c'è valore più importante della famiglia.
Europa jest dobrem wspólnym. Różnimy się, ale powinno nas łączyć wspólne dziedzictwo. Powróćmy do Unii Europejskiej, która z tego dziedzictwa wyrasta i która szanuje narodowe tożsamości. Only the European Union without arrogance, based on solidarity and mutual respect for its member states, can regain the support of the European nations. We can do it together.
Ladies and gentlemen, and right now, time for political section. Jorge Buxadé, head of Vox delegation at the European Parliament, Carlo Fidanza, head of Fratelli d'Italia, and professors Ryszard Legutko, co-chairman of ECR Group, and Zdzisław Krasnodębski, chairman of the Working Group for Institutional Reform. The European Union for the past decade has been shaken by crisis. The worst crisis of all, I think it's the mental crisis. Complete lack of reflection on the direction in which the Union is heading and ignoring the cause and effect between the federalist strategy pursued for years and recurring crisis. The ears, eyes and minds of the European elite are closed to all external stimuli that would encourage critical reflection, and such critical revision of thinking about the European Union is essential if we want it to survive. So therefore, we need to revisit basic questions and basic claims. Integration was created to help national states and not to gradually liquidate them and replace with something else. Which is why a political union on the old continent is an inherently dangerous undertaking, as it introduces too much freedom. Nation states for decades or even centuries have had developed mechanisms of checks and balances, balancing mutual influence of various political forces. We have division of powers, we have political accountability before voters and institutions, we have a clear-cut and tried and tested structure of power, but those things are missing in the European Union, and if they are outlined somewhere in the treaties, they do not fulfill their role. Because faced by the ever-growing brutal pressure towards federalization, they are not respected. In the EU, there is no separation of power, and we have very vague structure of power. It is not certain who in the EU makes top decisions. We know that they are taken differently than provided by treaties. European bodies with weak democratic legitimacy usurp superiority and supremacy in relation to national institutions democratically elected. We are currently witnessing deep political affiliation of European institutions. The European Commission is not a guardian of the treaties, but an openly biased tool for power and ideology. This all clearly indicates that this process must be brought to a halt, and we need to re-empower nation states. Because these are nation states that have all the political and legal tools to stop exuberant concentration of power and ensure the balance of power. They have developed cooperation practices. They guarantee multiplicity and diversity. An integrated Europe is a unified Europe which serves one ideology. The Europe of nations is a Europe of pluralism, a Europe of freedom and development. We are in favor and we advocate the latter, and we are going to our best for Europe to become the guiding idea of European people. Well, therefore, we need to revisit respecting the rights of all member states, sovereign member states, so the European Union can become a well-functioning partnership of national democracy. This campaign we are kickstarting today in Poland should be rolled out all across Europe, which is why I'm very happy that Professor Krasnodębski, whom I invite with me to the stage, will be joined by two our colleagues from the European Parliament, the leader of the Spanish delegation at ECR from Vox, Jorge Buxadé, and the head of Italian delegation, Fratelli d'Italia, Mr. Fidanza. I would like to welcome both our colleagues, Professor and Mr. Professor, in the studio. Dear colleagues, I would like us to start our conversation with a diagnosis which will be a negative one. I want us to make an attempt in answering the question, what currently poses a threat to the European Union? What are your fears? What are you anxious about while thinking about the future of the EU in the foreseeable future? Perhaps I'll ask Jorge to share his insights with us. Jorge, the floor is yours. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Professor. I would like to thank everyone. It's a great honor and privilege for me to take part in this conference. Democracy owes its existence to Christianity. You know who said this sentence? He wasn't a monk or a pope. It's not a sentence from the Vatican catechesis. It was said by Robert Schuman, the founder of the European Union. Democracy owes its existence to Christianity, and he said it half a century ago. Little is said about it, but founding fathers of the European Union, Jean Monnet, Konrad Adenauer and others, also Robert Schuman, they were Christians. And their Christianity is reflected by all steps and measures they have taken to unite Europe after World War II. The Treaty of Rome that gave rise to European communities were signed in the Eternal City, and it was no coincidence. We Europeans need to keep in mind where and our culture comes from. It wasn't a whim to have those treaties signed in Rome. Also, the flag of the European Union is equally important. It was designed by a practicing Christian, a Frenchman, and he took his inspiration from the Strasbourg Cathedral, which is adorned by 12 golden stars set against dark background. Today, in the era of political correctness, we need to keep in mind about it, because it was guiding the founding fathers of Europe who wanted to establish a body based on Christianity. The European Constitution was not adopted good because it would cut away Christian roots of Europe. I'm mentioning it because in order to talk about the future of Europe, the first thing we need to know is where do we come from, who we are. We need to answer those questions later, to answer the question what we want and what we do not want. We want to be masters of our own life. We do not want others to write the scenarios for us. We need to analyze our challenges, problems and opportunities. Right now in Brussels, a lot's been said about the future of Europe. It makes me very glad that at ECR we are also talking about it. It's an opportunity to modernize and upgrade the European Union, to make it better for all the citizens. Because the proposal of the European Commission, what we've had at the European Parliament, this is the same agenda recommended by progressive elites in Europe for decades. More federalization, globalization, more environmental protection, more gender ideology, more such initiatives, and more money for lobbyists. It all boils down to one thing: Brussels would have more power and less power would be granted to citizens and national parliaments. We are living in challenging times from the economic and health perspective, but despite it, this approach taken by elites is not changing. They are benefiting from this crisis in order to impose their agenda, their solutions on others. They want to impose pan-European taxes. They want to take away other competencies from national governments. And you know it very well in Poland, to what extent European institutions want to seize control about new areas. But we do not have to agree to that. Quite contrary, we need to say loud that certain things are dangerous, that certain things resemble repression, censorship, if you present ideas that are not aligned to mainstream ideas. Brussels cannot become the new Ministry of Truth. The vision of European citizens must be taken into consideration in the future of Europe. The future for elites in Brussels is already cut in stone, and everyone must follow suit. This is the road marked by globalization, equality. They believe everyone will be happy during this journey. But we can't permit for that, because we can't forget about our fatherland and God. We can't have leftist consensus taking away our human and personal freedom, because there are different ways of thinking, there are different solutions to problems we are struggling with individually and collectively as nations. My dear colleagues, our position, our standpoint cannot be limited to criticism of leftist ideas. This is what cowardly central right parties used to do in recent decades, who were too afraid to fully commit to their global mission. Such right-wing parties have accepted their position somewhere at the back behind left-wing parties, but we need to adopt a different, more powerful stance. We need to affirm our position. We need to speak aloud about the alternative to leftist ideas. We need to support truth, beauty and life. We need to speak about the identity of nations and sovereignty as the only guarantee of true European diversity. We do know that it's doable, and we recommend our model, the model we believe is better. There is another Europe which may come true. And we do hope it's going to happen in the future. We do hope that in the future we will have Europe hungry for freedom, which is not tantamount as anarchy, of lack of rules. We are looking for positive freedom that reinforces human bonds between nations. We want to have free men and not men who believe they are free and they are slave to modernity. We want to have Europe deeply rooted in its history, made up by sovereign nations who, out of their free will, take action and not are not forced by others, and this is something you can only achieve by criticizing those who attack you. We need to keep in mind about the spirit of the founding fathers of Europe.
Family is the basis. This is the key to our victory. We need to fight for our culture and identity, to defend them. We are speaking about the global level. This is the plane upon which to fight for our family and life. Not ignoring immigrants as it happens in Spain. Europe of different identities is much more than the global identity, is much more than a tourist destination. It is every living being of every nation that enjoys its sovereignty. It can and may be the whole independent entity like Poland or Italy. We have departed the ideas that the founding fathers of the European Union had. We need to follow their footsteps. We need to follow that path. It will pay off in the future. We shall defend Europe without any complexes. Thank you very much for holding this conference on behalf of my party for holding this debate. Thank you very much indeed, Jorge. And now, Carlo Fidanza is the addressee of the following question. How do you picture the image of Europe? What kind of colors or crayons would you use to picture it? First and foremost, let me express my profound gratitude for this invitation. Hello to Professor Legutko and Krasnodębski and all of you observing us sitting in our home, our friends from Poland. Hello to our friends from Polish Law and Justice. We are true colleagues in the European Parliament. I'd like to thank your Prime Minister, Mr. Morawiecki, and all of those who engaged in this astounding battle in the European Parliament. Giorgia Meloni and brethren from Italy supported you without any shadow of doubt. We were the only one in the parliament who were doing this way, not only because we belonged to the same group, because it would be too banal, but defense of treaties, your sovereignty, your government that has been legally elected by your citizens, the defense of your citizens, was a defense of this little share of our freedom, freedom of Poland, freedom Italy, against imposing the new politically correct dictatorship, against the will of nations. That is not the end of the battle. I cannot say what is the color that I would use to sketch the color of Europe. The global agenda never rests. It's unscrupulous. It uses legal and illegal ones. Legal or semi-legal, we are going to discover it in the weeks to come, to oppose patriots, our governments, our parliamentary powers. The stronger we grow, the stronger are the assaults, more ruthless. We believe that we are right history-wise. Nothing can stop us. They won't be able to stop us. Answering your question, I'll say it this way. The clash between patriots and globalists, between those that nurture the society and identity, and the flux kind of society. This is the way to delineate the way to the future of Europe. We need to rediscover common identity and belonging to history and common civilization, in which nations and countries were clashing, were fighting for their freedom. It was often tragic, but still advanced, culture-wise, civilization-wise, political-wise, for the benefit of our continent. Thus, when speaking in this conference organized by our Polish friends, I cannot help myself And not to quote John Paul II saying of this feeling of belonging to the unity, the Holy Father saw Europe breathing with two lungs, the Western one and the Eastern one. It was this horrible time with the Iron Curtain splitting Europe in two, Western Europe versus Russian dictatorship. The sense of Europe should be found in the words of great Paul. This is Christian values-founded unity, built upon something that is a binding element rather than technocratic or financial parameters that are wrapped down. This is the future of Europe. Thank you very much for organizing this crucially important event, the first leg of the journey, the first part of the roadshow in European capital cities, where we can speak about what is possible in Europe. Thank you, Carlo. And now, Professor Krasnodębski, what is your opinion? Future of Europe, the foreseeable future of Europe. We do agree that this is a difficult diagnosis and pretty negative. It's clear. We learned it in the previous panel. There are certain tendencies that make us agree with what the colleagues were saying. We are facing the necessity to engage in fight, to defend ourselves. There's no other way out. We fight for freedom of European nations. Today's threats to freedom are different compared to the tragic 20th century. Therefore, they come unnoticed on different occasions. No longer do we have military oppression, physical power, something that we can see at a glance, that can be observed in a physical way. The threats, the oppression is of different nature, be it the legal interpretation, as it was mentioned in the previous panel, specific narrative or tendencies, but still in place. We can see it day in, day out, in every European Parliament session and the session that we are going to launch this Monday. There is more and more people in Europe who want to wield power. This is the dream, to exercise power, to rule over us, to decide. When I see radical groups, lady MPs, airing out their opinions on Poland, I can see the desire to organize life here in Poland. We think differently. We respect one another. We respect our otherness, sovereign decisions that are made by European nations. We love European diversity. I do not want to tell our colleagues in Spain or Italy how to live, how to act, how to comprehend human dignity, as mentioned in the previous panel, fundamental rights, the rule of law. But there are people possessed by the desire to wield power. They push for something very dangerous. I remember one of the previous chairpersons of the Parliament, unquestionable representative of this stream, pretty influential. He set the tone. He was quite despotic in ruling this parliament. Upon returning to his country, he was called a messiah, a political messiah, and now he is a backbencher. Because the nation did discover lack of leadership craft. It's easier to think about power in the European Parliament and teach the lesson to Poles, Slavs, Slovaks, Bulgarians, rather than to act in your country, to carry out changes he found obvious and necessary, yet regarded by his. brethren in the country. It shows the process, living true democracy, legitimizing of our activities of politicians is rooted in national communities. We need to strengthen the rights of our national communities that are the basis for democracy. We need to act together. I'm very happy to have been able to meet in this contrast. This is the onset of pan-European roadshow. May this roadshow change Europe according to our spirit and will contribute to that.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. We all know the English term, an ever closer union, the ever-integrating or closer union. So at the European Parliament, it's being reiterated time and time again. It's a buzzword that in the past it sounds desirable, meaning that it was a call for in-depth partnership on the old continent. As this continent was brutalized and violated and conflicted after the war. But currently, this term of the continuously integrating Europe sounds ominous. Because it stands and it means that competencies of member states are taken over by European institutions, and especially in some member states, those weaker ones. And this is my question. Perhaps it's time to say it loud and clear that this slogan is harmful. Perhaps it should be deleted from the treaties, and perhaps we should be saying openly that European integration has its limits, and perhaps we've reached the limit, perhaps we've overstepped the mark. Perhaps it's time to speak out loud about specific solutions, and instead of using the romantic rhetorics of the brotherhood, we can't continue with bureaucratization and politicization of the European Union. So this is the question I ask Carlo Fidanza. By the way, I would like to thank you and your party for supporting us during those challenging times in recent months. Carlo, the floor is yours. Well, thank you very much, Professor. It's great pleasure for me to be here. When we are talking about a community made up by nation states, it must be a consistent European Union that must be willing to come together to face challenges of the future. But the concept of the European Union, this ever closer union, as stated in the treaty, yes, there is a risk that it may evolve into a mantra repeated by people who believe that giving away your sovereignty to Brussels is a response to current challenges. So it seems to me that right now the European Union should be united in some aspects, perhaps the foreign policy, some aspects of defense policy, NATO-wise, or protecting external borders against illegal immigration mentioned by Jorge in his address. There are more and more elements where we have exhausted the limit. We are now facing the wall and we need to step back. Certain elements imposed by mainstream, the rule of law that has been mentioned time and time again, the exuberant ideology related to environmental protection is right now commonly used to infringe even more national sovereignty. I'm sure the European Union should not interfere with protection of family rights or alimentary needs of our citizens. Recently in Brussels, we've had that mandatory labels will be mandatorily introduced, what would stand in contrast with our traditional nutritional habits and patterns. And Brussels and Germany are totally ignoring the specific profile of national food production. So we also believe that to a lesser extent, Brussels should focus on education and deal with education, which should be covered by competencies of member states as provided by treaties. In the initial months of pandemics, we saw absolute lack of cooperation on health issues. Finally, the Union started doing something, and right now some people believe that health should become a European competence. I disagree. We should boost cooperation, and we saw it in recent horrific months, especially in spring, but it's a competence that should remain on the level of member states in Italy, but also beyond Italy. Those competencies are exercised on regional and local level. So it would be even impossible for us to centralize those functions and give those competencies away. So we should focus on coordination of national policies. So these are examples that I've listed to prove that if we need to redefine new areas dealt with by the European Union, we definitely need to amend treaties, reform treaties, and this is something that we would like to strive for, but we're also realistic. So we need to say aloud that right now, if we open Pandora's box, amending treaties with the current majority in Brussels, at the Parliament and in the Commission, we would certainly be dealing with the overwhelming majority of globalists and people who want to restrict sovereignty even more and give it away to technocratic structure which are not democratically elected. So it seems to me the time for struggle, time to fight, to amend this term, the ever-closing Europe, has not yet come, but it's time to present and highlight during such events like today's event our alternative ideas, and later those alternative ideas can be translated into specific activities. Also, thanks to the support of ECR. Okay, can I ask you to comment, Jorge? Well, dear colleagues, well,
jeśli mamy problemy z połączeniem się z...
Well, you know, we have no connection with Spain, so perhaps I'll address this question to my colleague, and when Jorge joins us again. Well, unfortunately, Europe is not as digital as it has been announced by the European Union. Let me put it this way. This term, the ever closer union, the ever closer integration, well, indeed, it leads to uniformization. It leads to imposing unified patterns and standards in all spheres of life. which do not fall within the competencies of the EU. For example, education or culture, they do, but all the limits, everything that is written in the treaties, it's not respected. The Union is expanding its competencies in times of crisis, like this crisis, what leads to further federalization of the Union. It's a negative phenomenon, which is why we are beginning to talk about it very loud, because this ever closer integration leaves us with no air to breathe. As European nations, someone else is taking decisions for us. So this is what has led to Brexit and the results of the referendum in the UK, because more and more citizens have a sense that no decisions are taken on the country level, that our national parliaments are becoming houses where theoretical discussions are conducted, while relevant decisions on the economic or climate policy are taken elsewhere. We need solidarity all across Europe. But I'll use this classic distinction of Émile Durkheim. There is mechanical solidarity, which is about similarity. We should all become similar. And there is also organic similarity. Thanks to diversity, we supplement and complement each other. And this solidarity, which is on the rise, and it's highly positive, and it makes us very glad that our Italian colleagues are taking interest in the position of the Polish government, that they are defending our interest at the European Parliament. Elections in Spain or in Italy, we are familiar with the background. We are watching each other closely because we need to understand each other better. Benefiting from new technologies, new communication techniques. So I agree with Carlo Fidanza that in some spheres of life, perhaps we need more collaboration and less in others. But first and foremost, cooperation must be based on respect for sovereign rights of the nation, of democratic choices made by local governments. We need to respect cultural diversity, and we need to respect political sovereignty, and it must be done on voluntary basis. And this is happening in front of our very eyes. The union is evolving into a union of harassment and duress. There is less and less freedom at universities, in the media today. It requires a lot of courage to advocate political ideas in Europe we are advocating today, because you are stigmatized as a populist, a Eurosceptic, and someone who's unworthy of respect. Because touching and addressing the taboo, tackling those terms that you have quoted, the ever closer union, disqualifies your intellectual and political potential. So integration used to strengthen nation states and countries in the past. It was an element of freedom back in Central Europe. We wanted to revisit Europe and become a part of Europe again. And when we did, we've learned that this space, which was a space of philosophical literature diversity, it's becoming the space of enslavement, compulsion. There are even examples of people who are moving to our part of Europe because they believe you still have space to freely express your ideas. You have living European traditions which elsewhere are marginalized. For example, Christianity, which is the foundation of our culture, and my colleagues have mentioned it. Thank you very much.
And back to Spain. I believe that now the connection is okay. Jorge, the floor is yours. If you could refer to this question again. Yes, Professor Legutko. I do apologize for technical inconveniences. I do agree with Professor Krasnodębski and Carlo Fidanza. Indeed, the concept of ever closer Europe, being an ever closer union, is the way for the European Commission to have more and more power. They paint the future in flamboyant colors, yet the future will be grey and dull because these will be centrally made decisions. A more unified Europe will be in contrast to sovereignty of particular states. No longer will there be sovereign states. Myself, being a Spaniard, I feel closer to Poland and France and other member states when I do it because I feel free to do so, not because I'm coerced by Brussels that tells me how to unite, how to create my relations with me, myself, and other European nations. Therefore, we need to defend the idea of Europe. We need to showcase the ever closer Europe's idea being the one that deprives you of freedom and free will. This slogan is coined up to impose something upon member states. We are not liquids, we are people. Contrary to liquids, we cannot mix together as they do in chemical experiments. The treaty's concepts are not that important. What is most important is that particular sovereign nations should be the hero of whatever happens in Europe, be it the nation of Poland, Spain, France. They need to make their own decisions. An apparent example, as my previous speaker said, is Brexit. The crisis motivated by the Commission that tries to impose their decisions upon the member states. This will lead to the collapse of the European Union. This concept of Europe that is composed of free member states that want to cooperate because they enjoy their sovereignty, may result in true United States of Europe, so that we are closer to our people. We don't have to use a flamboyant language, but lead to crisis. The ever closer union has this kind of consequence. It justifies treaties violations, rules violations. All rules that limit European Union's operation is treated interim, temporary. They are crumbled, stretched, violated, yet this is tolerated. Article 5 is the infamous one when we speak about competences. The competences they should exercise are the ones stipulated in the treaties. No other competences do they have. And this is a systemic violation, I would say. by the very same institution, by the very nature, expand their powers. They are violated and tolerated by governments, leaders, political milieus of Europe. So the question is as follows. Why does it happen? Why are we so tolerant, not only in the structures, in institutions, but in more general European politics, this kind of tolerance, when Article 5 is violated, competences, proportionality is violated, all the rules that were supposed to deliver this freedom of space of freedom. Let me refer to what Jorge said in his first intervention when he was speaking about left wing's dominance in European policies. That left wing engulfs everything. These nominal conservative parties in the EPC may be related to this dominance of the left wing. So expansive, ideological, supranational, international, cosmopolitan. And weakness of this conservative part, this truly conservative. One of the possibilities is to create truly conservative structures, not the international kind of as it used to be, but a kind of alliance of the states that could oppose it, to call a spade, that this is the ever-growing despotism of the left wing in Europe. Carlo Fidanza, let me start with you now. A word of comment from you. The computer says no, we've lost connection. How about Spanish point of view? Jorge, the floor is yours. Thank you, Professor Legutko. In my opinion, there is a key question to our debate. It is a very difficult question to answer in a short time allocated for our discussion. Post the Second World War, there was this kind of the global international movement that is utterly wrong, or delivers wrong conclusions on purpose. I don't know what's the true story behind it. Instead of blaming and hurling responsibility upon the Second World War and doctrines, Nazism, communism, the armed conflict was triggered by national countries. This is some people's understanding of the politics, of the world, of countries' management. This line of thinking is becoming more and more popular because of the left-wing parties. They believe there is the left-wing's dream to give up on division into nations, families, do away with faith, with the things that we find so important, because this is what human dignity is composed of. The right wing, the freedom movements, more or less informed way, have they noticed these pluralistic tendencies and international companies that abuse the situation. They should defend the idea that this is the nation that gives people identity. The left wings do not comprehend it. Their perception is different, at least in Spain. In other countries it might be different. In Spain, People's Party, the right-wing party, part of EPR, has shown that they cannot defend the true value, sovereignty, competences, lifestyle, culture, traditions. European People's Party cannot defend it in Brussels. Politicians are sent to Brussels to request for money. Let me put it this way. Money is the devil. There's nothing like free lunch. You need to give your soul in exchange for money. Us, the conservative parties, the parties of reformers, we do value family, dignity. This makes us equally good or even better Europeans compared to others. We cannot go to Brussels only to bring some money back, as socialist governments starting 1985 in Spain used to do, and right-wing governments. It can't be this way. We need to make the best of, the most of treaties provisions, with goodwill being a decoy beacon. And what Carla Fidanza said is a very good example. The pandemic's time, coordination of the countries on health protection. This is what European Union should be busy with, to coordinate countries' activities, to make them more efficient, to defend external borders of the European Union, to take the best care of health and well-being of its citizens of the European Union. Now, Brussels wishes to take over all kinds of competences in the health sector. We disagree to that utterly and completely, because health of our citizens, this is our country's competence. There are other problems associated with health in Poland, Czechia, Spain. Our countries are organized differently. Different traditions, different histories, different cultures, different modes of operations. We cannot lose it. No country can lose it.
Well, thank you very much, and we are coming back to Italy because Carla is back with us again. Well, of course, I do agree with everything Jorge said, and I would like to thank Professor Legutko for this question, because it seems to me that going back in history is important, because we are now in a space in time where we no longer have sovereignty, national sovereignty, and the power is wielded not by democratically elected people, but some giant financial institutions. We do not know where they come from, how they've been appointed, and this fits perfectly and reflects perfectly current developments. Of course, right now we do not see that the concept of the founding fathers of the European Union mentioned by Jorge Buxadé and Robert Schuman is made a reality. It's rather the vision of Antonio Spinelli. In Brussels, we have a room dedicated to him, and of course I do respect him, although he was my political opponent. But Spinelli's Europe is socialist Europe. It's a Europe that was heading towards undermining national sovereignty after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The progressive elites, which until then were brought together with the Soviets to a certain extent. They changed their mind and they said, okay, let's replace the Soviet Union with the EU. Let's replace the ruble with the euro. Let's replace the communist internationalism with European rhetorics. Let's replace protection of workers with protection of illegal migrants. And this is what has been happening in recent years. So mainstream ideas, which are in fact post-communist. And undoubtedly, what has contributed to this is the weakness of our centrist, right-wing political classes, at least in Italy. Those parties were painfully weak, and which is why this ideology dominated in key sectors, in key areas. It dominated the narrative, universities, schools, courts, were seized by communists, and many years later we are dealing with this cultural hegemony, and we want to fight it. We need to do that, and we can do it if we strive towards Europe, which is a union of people and nations. But it's also respecting the principle of subsidiarity. So drawing on current competencies of the European Union, we can not only expand competencies of the European Union, but also have them limited. So it doesn't have to be the ever-closing union, not always. Families, schools, religious communities, cultural associations, trade associations, which are also an expression of the social fabric. These are things which matter most to us. We need to redefine how the European Union should operate. It should be less centralized, should be brought closer to citizens. People want to see that their local problems are solved by people who work in their proximity. The European Union should contribute a value added in line with the principle of subsidiarity. This rule is a political concept. It's not only a legal concept. But more and more frequently, this principle is disregarded by Brussels. And of course, to have it respected, we need to keep in mind that there must be political will. And to get the majority, we need to build an alliance between governments. In recent days, we have realized how important cooperation was between the Polish and Hungarian governments. But in order to build European unity, and especially in recent years, the key role was played by France and Germany. It seems that our political family, European conservatives and reformists, that we can become tour de force. We can head off from Poland and we will very soon reach Italy and Spain. Just see how beautiful and big block of countries we could create with 140 million people, our colleagues, who are campaigning in their own countries to get the majority. I'm sure Jorge will agree with us to make it happen. Fratelli d'Italia and Vox, we need to win elections in our countries as soon as possible to reinforce this axis. There is hope, and it's a wish, but it's also something that I hope, and I'm addressing my message not only to people who are taking part in our conversation, in our event, but everyone who is a part of our political family. I'm addressing my message to everyone who sympathizes with centrist parties. We want to represent conservative, patriotic right-wing parties, but we can do it by winning elections in our country to bring about much-needed change. In reply to your question, what are the reasons behind the expansion of competencies of the European Union? Why are competencies taken away from member states? Why we are violating the rule of subsidiarity? There are three layers to that. Well, first of all, there is leftist ideology, which is the most distinctive. Its most distinctive element today is extreme individualism, freedom of choice. I decide, I choose, plus something that combines with it the idea of the ultimately open society, which creates no limits, no restrictions, whether it is the beginning of your life or the autumn of your life or your lifestyle. And of course, some find it very attractive because it's very liberating. Of course, it blurs all communities, including national community, family, communal life, and it also disrupts our social norms because you are no longer bound by norms. So it's interesting, the leftist ideas are advocated by big money. We all know a certain billionaire who is supporting very radical movements in Poland and Hungary and supporting certain ideologies. So in the past, left-wing parties used to combat capitalists. These were two social classes at war. And now we have an alliance, which was aptly described by Sławoj Žižek, for example, who wrote about the mentality, about the mindset of people of post-1968 generation who are now heading world's leading corporations. But globalization, the world without borders, is globalized, so you can do business on a global scale. And there is another element that comes into play that triggers this movement towards centralization, taking away national rights in Europe. And we also see it advocated by former conservative parties. It's a dogma and belief that small nations should not exist, not only because they believe it's nationalism and nation states that led to disasters in the 20th century, because it's nonsense. Communism and National Socialism were not created by nation states. These were totalitarian ideologies, but nevertheless, it's about conviction that there is no place on this world for small countries, for small nations. We keep it being repeated time and time again in Brussels in order to compete with China and the US. We need a new united Europe. And every time, whenever a problem persists, there is only one solution. We need more Europe. A think tank of the Parliament is publishing a whole series of analysis publications titled "The Cost of No Europe." If there is no Europe, we are paying a cost. They never thought of publishing a publication about the cost of Europe, about the cost of integration, the social cost. What's the cost for freedom, culture, economy? And in addition, my colleagues have rightly mentioned the COVID crisis. Of course, we we are abusing and playing on people's fear. European Union is evolving into a union of fear, a union of compulsion. We are afraid to be alone, so we look forward to Brussels to give us a helping hand and drag us out of this crisis, give us more money, tell us how to behave, how to act in different issues. We do not want to take a decision in our country because it's a politically challenging decision. Let's Brussels decide for us. And unfortunately, we need to talk to our citizens and we need to shift our mindset. We need to make people realize the cost of ever-closing Union. The cost is massive because we are eroding foundations of European civilization. We are eroding European families and individual freedom.
Thank you very much. The time slot for this session is nearing the end. A quick punchline to the session. We are facing a difficult situation. European Union needs to act decisively, and the action must be done on different levels and planes. We've got the lowest plane, closest ambience of ours, the society, the town, the country. The basic thing that we should do is not to give up on the competences unless we have to, which is very often the case. Sometimes, even not requested, we kind of cuddle under the European Union's Brussels umbrella. Second of all, we need to present the dispute we are facing at the moment in a clear and apparent way. The two sides, where is our place? And we must not make the mistake the European People's Party made and its members. They wanted to dissolve and take over the mainstream, and they were devoured as the result. Dominated. And there is a whole array of practical measures, what Professor Krasnodębski was speaking about, the last motive of his presentation. Information on European Union as it is, as it operates. This information is scarce, mystified. Nobody asks about consequences of social engineering as such. This requires a thorough description. And a very important thing for every politician, including what Carla Fidanza was speaking about. You need to win elections. Only then will you be able to make the best of the instruments that Europe provides, even European Union as it is now. You can use legal instruments and political instruments. This is something we need to utilize. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Jorge Buxadé, Carlo Fidanza. I'm pleased to have hosted you. Professor Krasnodębski, thank you very much. As you know, this is the first phase. There are more phases. Sofia is next, the capital of Bulgaria. I'm really happy to have news from Bulgarian Federation's leader message, Angela Dzhambazki.
Здравейте, уважаеми преподаватели, професори, уважаеми съратници.
Welcome to you, professors.
Скъпи полски съмишленици.
Allies from law and justice.
Полезна и важна първа дискусия, която се организира
I
в
send
Варшава,
my greetings
посветена на бъдещето
to
на
those
Европа,
participating in
бъдещето на
this
Европа, такова
discussion.
каквото ние, семейството на консерваторите, семейството на тези, които уважаваме националните държави,
The future of Europe,
националната си памет и националното си определение, желаем да
we
бъде.
conservatives perceive.
Тази конференция е изключително важна и полезна, защото дава
This conference is of utmost importance. It's very useful because it provides the only sensible answer to left-wing propaganda that is omnipresent. This scandalous attempts of social engineering to swap ideologies, to replace the free market idea, to replace it with single-sex marriages, and all kinds of ideas. We need to give a clear response. We need to be tough and intelligent. That's the way it is at Warsaw First Conference, and I'm sending my greetings to the participants. Very useful. It gives a different point of view, a serious and intelligent one. We are going to have even more meetings throughout Europe, Europe that respects national states, subsidiarity, self-reliance of international, national and foreign policies. This is our response to Marxist globalization. The green ones, left-wing liberals, they have created a broad-scope anti-national coalition. Together with the movements based on the communist internationals.
Идеята на комунистическия болшевизъм в нови модерни дрежки, дрежките на глобализма, дрежките на...
Communist Bolshevism is disguised in new outfit of genderism that tries to change the idea of our country, of national states, of the family. Therefore, in our conference, we are going to speak about how to fight illegal immigration, how to combat national borders, European Union borders, how to defend tradition and the idea of the family. The family is a relation of a man and a woman, nothing more, nothing less, according with their free will, biological origin of gender and sex, man, women, nature, natural biological way. Other things constitute left-wing ideology, Marxist ideology. Ideology we need to face and combat against. This will be the topic of the conference. This is where we have our representatives, people who believe in us. We are waiting for you in Sofia at the conference, where we're going to present our ideas. Then we'll meet in Italy, Spain, and other countries where our family partners live, conservatives and reformers. Thank you very much. All the best to you, and may we be able to defend the Europe of sovereign states, national states, healthy national foundations. Stay healthy. I'd like to thank the leaders of European conservatives and reformists for indicating this very simple and banal truth. European Union origin has got Christian values. So very often we've heard about European values. These are not the same values we are speaking about. I hope you've heard the voice from Warsaw, up there in Brussels, in European Parliament. We need to have hope that today is the beginning of tomorrow's better future of the European community. Today, it was the onset of the meetings organized by conservatives and reformists. The future of Europe, New Hope. The consecutive ECR meeting will be held in January in Bulgaria. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, and good night.
Tak, dobrze, może byśmy jeszcze coś podyskutowali.